It's not right, Alf.
Yeah, it was Scottish Gas. I was complaining about the price of electricity in Scotland.
Well, listen, what about the price of your phone call? That's just as bad. Alf, listen, it's great to have you on, mate. Again, second time on. I tell you why, because the discussion on colonialism is just going out of this world. I think it's now on people's lips everywhere I go, especially at Caledon. What is it? Is it now the time now? Do you think? How has it all happened? Are we looking for new answers after the SNP's hammering at the polls? What do you think's the cause of all this?
Well, I think a lot of people wondered what was happening after the referendum because everything went quiet, and then we had massive majorities of nationalist MPs, but they did nothing when they got in. And people were wondering what's going on here. And then you have the rupture in the movement. But, as you know, I'm a student of postcolonial theory. Postcolonial theory tells us that all this happens. You have a dominant national party that when it gets elected, it goes down a different road. It seeks that accommodation with colonialism, and it becomes part of the racket, really. Mm-hmm. And then that's what ruptures the movement. That's what leads to the creation of the new parties, the new organisations that have been created, all the movements. Mm-hmm. The movement doesn't go away, and the support for independence doesn't go away, because once you want independence, you didn't really unwant it. Mm-hmm. The rupture in the movement is all part of postcolonial theory. It predicts this is going to happen, and that's based on all the literature that's been developed through decolonizations over the last century. Mm-hmm. So all that literature that people can access if they want, and I've tried to study as much of it as I can.
Yes, well, if post-colonial theory, if post-colonial theory is structured that way and it's a well-worn path, isn't the well-worn path after that something good for Scotland as well?
Yes, it should be once people understand their wretchedness in that sense, because colonialism is basically just, first of all, it's economic plunder. Mm-hmm. So the resources are all stripped out cheap, and the people don't get access to them. But so people have to understand this. Of course, there is a colonial hoax at play. Colonialism is based on psychology. So it's not just economic plunder. It's based on psychology. We're given this one nation Britain concept. Mm-hmm. The assimilation process through language and culture, cultural imperialism, cultural assimilation. The elites take that on, of course. Everybody in the professions, the elites become part of that, and it's the lower orders, if you like, the working class that are marginalised and cast aside. So we're left with a situation where half the people living in close to poverty today. Mm-hmm. But a lot of people are part of the system, part of that colonial system, and they're doing well out of the system. So the split with the bourgeoisie, if you like, mm-hmm. that's what mm-hmm. postcolonial theory tells you. The bourgeoisie become part of the racket as well. The political classes, they all are doing very well out of the system, and they're quite happy to make as much socio and economic distance between them and the people as they can, and that's what's holding up the process at the moment.
Right, but are things changing? Because I can tell you this, I've noticed housewives in the local shops going aghast at UK brand and their loaves and their carrots, and they are absolutely avoiding them, trying to find something else that doesn't have that Union flag on it. I heard a beautiful conversation, a young guy on his phone talking in old Scots. You could have taken him back centuries, the way he was speaking about timorous and all that kind of stuff. He was using his words really poetically. And I think, I know that if you go to university, and I've been to university, you have to speak properly. And if you go to the library here, you have to speak properly so you can get understood. But see, at a grassroots level, I think there's a return. I think people are sticking two fingers up at all this.
Well, postcolonial theory tells you, Norrie, that the first thing a people grasp once they are decolonising their mind, if you like, is their language, because it's the main thing that gives them the diversity of peoples, and it's the basis of the culture. And the culture and the language gives you the national consciousness. We saw that in Germany in the Euros, where over 100,000 kilted folk with the bagpipes and everything, there and doing Munich and the high street in Munich and everything. So, yeah, that's national consciousness. People just, that's what gives them the desire for nationhood. So without that national consciousness, that's why in the book Dún Hodden, which you've kindly promoted in the past, the first two chapters are culture and language, because postcolonial theory tells you that's the basis of your national consciousness. That's what gives you the desire for independence, liberation, nationhood, all the rest of it. Without that, there's no demand for nationhood or independence. So the politicians have completely missed this, of course, because the politicians don't yet understand what independence means.
Yes.
And this is the conclusion I got to when I was writing the book and studying postcolonial theory, as I did since before the referendum. So that was a decade of my time doing that. The basis of it is your national consciousness, and without that, so the basis, the solidarity of the independence movement is really based on the oppressed ethnic group, if you like.
Yes.
People don't like to talk about ethnicity. I don't know why. It's a fact of science and life. And people, colonized people are subject to ethnic oppression. We have to remember that, and they also internalise that oppression. That's what gives us that Scottish cultural cringe we all talk about, but we don't really understand it. Quite often we don't. It's actually part of the psychological condition, the colonial mindset.
Yes, and it's been forced upon us. We didn't want this, of course.
Oh. And you can imagine Scotland if it wasn't subject to Anglicisation and cultural assimilation, the BBC for 100 years, and all the propaganda we've had for the British press and everything for a couple of 100 years. So all that propaganda and the educational process, as you mentioned, there's no Scots language taught. There's a bit of Gaelic now, but there's no Scots language taught. There's no Scots language higher qualification in school. There's no Scots language degree. There's no Scots language teachers dedicated to the subject. And most of the teachers in our schools now didn't have Scots. The bourgeois middle class, professional classes discarded the language, and most of the teachers in certain parts of Scotland aren't even Scottish, so they didn't have any Scots words that we have.
No, they don't.
And so they're communicating with Scots bairns in schools in an alien language to begin with, and which is a problem, and that leads into the attainment gap.
That's right. Well, do you know this, Alf? I had the pleasure and privilege of going to Edencore Theatre to watch Sunset Song. And it was a great reminder of an oppressed community struggling to get themselves out of the farming, the low-paid economy, and going to university. And somebody had to speak a different way. And there was this animosity towards her because the language was us. It was.
Yeah. Well, Graphic Gibbon's work is a classic, of course, and there's so much literature that we should understand and learn more from. But the fact remains that the universities are a distant dream for most Scots now. Even today, and there's some data that it might well be less than 25% of Scots actually get into Scottish universities, which is half the rate in most developed countries. I know. So and I know from working in the universities for 30 years or thereabouts that the university focus is very much on attracting high-fee international students. And that reduces the amount of places for Scottish students, even in critical subject areas like medicine, where the fees for international students are exorbitant. So the global elites come to Scotland to study, and there's places made available for them, but not for Scots. So this goes into that reality that your own people aren't educated as they should be. No,
I remember when I was at university in 2004, there was a lot of Chinese and Americans had come over to study at Aberdeen University. It was one of those...
Well, that's right. They've all got offices in India, in China to market Scottish degrees. And these students in middle class and upper class students in all these areas around the world, their parents want them to get high status British degrees.
Aye.
So the universities in Scotland are just part of that racket, and part of the just commercial enterprises rather masquerading as charities.
Yeah, indeed.
And they don't because they don't do much for Scotland. Because look at our economic growth is static. Our GDP per capita is a third of Norway's, half of Denmark's. And we've got more resources than them. I did a study recently showing our GDP per capita at $40,000 is half of what it should be. And that's even a lot less than Ireland and Switzerland and Norway. Mm-hmm. But with our resources, we should at least be double the GDP. And that's equivalent to a loss of £150 billion a year.
It's huge.
From the economy.
Yeah, it's absolutely
that's
massive.
3 times as the Holyrood budget.
I
So
know.
the cost of colonialism, if you like, I would estimate, if you look at that GDP per capita, is about 150 billion a year. That's what's being sucked out of this economy through interception of all the wealth.
I know. Alf, the weekend was full of sport. The Euros came to a conclusion. England got beat. And do you know this? I was watching it. My wife is not a football fan. And when the first goal went in, the iPad was on the air. The tea was nearly spilt. She was just shouting for joy. What is that telling us about ordinary people and the way we treat our neighbours now?
I don't know. If football, it used to be, Scots would be quite keen to see, England not necessarily win again, because we'd have our noses rubbed in it for months, or years after 1966. Because I remember, but what I thought this time was actually it wouldn't be so bad if England won, because it might have liberated the people and made them think a wee bit about their own independence. Because obviously, if there's a desire for English independence, that automatically frees up the Celtic periphery. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's another way of looking at it. Some people have mentioned this before, that Scotland might get its independence if England goes independent first. And Brexit was really an English shout for a sort of liberation. Mm-hmm. Because they felt kind of oppressed, maybe from Brussels in some countries too. Right? But the reality democratically was it was a problem for Scots, because we voted to stay in, but were forced out. Mm-hmm. And that's what essentially colonialism is. Colonialism is geographic force.
Yes.
Whether it's political, economic, or military, it's force. It's force. And so you're forced to do things you didn't necessarily want to do. It's not democratic. It's not equality. So the Scots have a problem here. But I wasn't too bothered really about if England had won, because I would have thought it would give English national identity a boost.
Yes, I was half thinking that myself. I wasn't that bothered. If they'd won, well, we're going to see this everywhere, and Englishness will be everything. And it might just be the catalyst for them saying, do you know what? England rather than Britain.
Well, colonialism is a hoax, and it gives people, as the singer Dick Gaughan said, an illusion of culture.
Aye, that's right.
This idea of British culture, and you mentioned it, we get all these programs thrown at us with British this, British that, and the British flag and everything. Mm-hmm. And it is a cultural illusion, because the United Kingdom is as a country is really an illusion. It's a collection of countries, as we know, and they try to pass it off as a single country. And this is where English football fans then get confused themselves, because some of them wave the Union Jack and they sing the British national anthem.
That's right.
And English identity can get absorbed into that as well, and made a bit obscure. As Scottish identity is simply cast aside in the British context. But it is a cultural illusion, because it gives people, as the linguist Purvis quoted, was it gives people a false persona.
It does.
Rather than what Professor Tom Devine called a Joe persona.
Yeah.
That dual persona being Scottish and British.
No.
That's just an illusion, a cultural illusion. But that's what the cultural assimilation process does. It puts on people this idea that they want that identity, they need that identity, they crave dependence. And that gets you into the post-colonial theory about dependency complex. And that's the psychological condition that provides, the mechanism for that colonial mindset, particularly amongst the hierarchy of a native people that want assimilation, they want dependency.
Well, Alpha, it's now 75 years on from the National Covenant, set up in October 1949. Many don't know about this because that's another trait of colonialism. We're denied our own history. But this was a thing set up, and the elites did sign up for this. This was they were advocating for a Scottish Parliament back in 1949. It took them a long time for it to get there, but that was a civic movement that started off in Scotland by the people.
Yeah, and I think there was still a strong affinity with Britishness after the Second War, particularly, and so they went. The cry has always been for home rule within a UK, within a British imperial context, which is which is where we are at the moment with a degree of home rule. But as we all know, it's not really a real parliament. It's a limited parliament. Limited powers. So, and there was great movement in that time. So basically, decolonisation in Scotland, the process has been going on for a century or a couple of centuries, really.
Yeah.
It's never gone away. No. The desire for liberation and independence from an oppressor, if you like, has been going on since the Union Treaty was signed.
Yes.
There was, first of all, the wars called the rebellions, but really just wars of independence, and then the banishment of the natives. A lot of people transported out, millions of Scots were transported out, and that in post-colonial theory is termed banishment of the natives. And the lands are confiscated, the people are evicted, and the oppressor power then provides mechanisms and levers to move and ship the people out and then replace them. And the population displacement, as we know, is ongoing, because one of the things, when you lose your sovereignty, you lose the power over your borders and your population.
That's right.
So we don't have any charge or any control over our population, but that's not to say our population isn't being managed on our behalf, but not necessarily in our interest.
Not in our interest, no.
And I mentioned students and housing, and the housing crisis. Everything's in crisis at the moment, but the housing crisis in cities is to some extent due to the excessive volumes of students coming into Scotland. And the thousands of student apartments, but also the fact that the housing market is completely open to outside buyers. So Scotland is effectively being bought up.
Exactly. And
the young people here can't afford houses. They can't get well enough paid jobs to bring up families. So the birth rate of Indigenous Scots is the lowest on record.
Right.
So the population is being managed, but not necessarily in our interest.
Well, we haven't even delved into free ports and special economic zones that are coming our way off. This is going to nick our territory. Never mind our language and our culture.
Well, that's right. The model that Sunak or Tories introduced to Scotland was free ports. It's a particularly unusual model as well internationally, because, as you know, my area is shipping originally, shipping economics, and I studied container ports and container free zones around the world, which in many cases actually work quite positively to help a country develop its competitiveness and develop trade. But the kind of model that the Tories are introducing is completely irregular in that sense. It's a bit like the privatisation of the ports and airports that we had, which included privatisation of regulatory powers as well as land ownership. What ports internationally do is they don't sell port land. They just get an operator to operate over a concession period, and the state continues to own and regulate it. We've done is we've just completely deregulated, given it over to the banks and offshore equity funds, and they regulate our estuaries now, as Clyde, Forth, Tay, and that's why we've not seen modern port investment. And we get the bizarre situation where Scotland's capital city hasn't got a cruise port, so all the cruise ships have to berth midstream and tender people ashore like a less developed country. But we are a less developed country, and this is the problem.
Yes.
Our infrastructure is substandard. Our economy is below par. Our GDP per capita is half of what it should be. We're leaking out 150 billion in value a year across all sectors of the economy, and that is the cost of colonialism.
Yeah, well, yesterday as I was watching the golf, it's right on the coast, this golf course where they played the Scottish Open, and they viewed a big ocean liner, a big cruise liner, and it was away out in the distance, and it was just sitting there.
Yeah.
There was nowhere for it to come into.
Well, this is it. A project I've been working on for years to try and get interest in was Cockenzie as a cruise and ferry port for Scotland.
Aye.
And the site of the old power station, that was originally I studied that for Scottish Power in the 1990s because they envisaged it would close and be ready for redevelopment. And they wanted to develop a modern port there. And me, as a former shipping clerk and ship agent in the Firth of Forth, at least, I knew for a fact that our port facilities were inadequate.
Yeah, Victorian.
And compared to any international comparison, we were really underdeveloped and really out of the business. So we could have developed a proper pier at Cockenzie, much like the Orkney Islands Council, the smallest council in Scotland, developed in Kirkwall. A 400-metre pier, 10-metre depth of water, and it handles the biggest cruise ships in the world here in Kirkwall.
I know.
So, and it can handle 2 or 3 at one time, plus ferries. So ferries to the continent were another thing that would have been a cultural as well as trading imperative, and also for an independent Scotland, which I was amazed that the SNP made no movement on this to develop international connections, to develop international ports, because if they were serious about independence, you'd have to reorientate our trade away from England, because all our trade is focused on the mother country. All our goods are taken out that way, and all our imports come in through that channel, most of them. So we have to do what most decolonised territories have to do, including Ireland had to do, was build up its ports and international shipping connections away from England and get its logistics sorted out, become part of the world trading system. And this is what Scotland should have done. And when I worked in shipping, we came in in the 70s. I came in at the tail end of our traditional European connections, where every day we had a ship going to a continental country, and all that was lost. And all our Scottish trade eventually forced through English ports and eventually just marginalised.
Do you know this, Alf? I speak to many people from across the world, and especially in Denmark, Iceland, Ireland as well, always say, what is happening with Scotland? Why are you so stupid? Why are you so slow? But they weren't colonised. Well, Ireland was, to a certain extent. But we've just seen recently that the Irish politicians have said there's abstention rules within Sinn Féin. We don't go there, and I'll tell you why, because these are the reasons, and it's worked for us. And then we come back to Scotland. Why is Scotland, and all the European nations are looking at us, wondering and scratching their heads, why is Scotland so bloody slow and so stupid? And I get really embarrassed out of this, but it must be colonialism. It can't just be that, can it? There's something else?
Well, I think it does go back to the colonial mindset is a proven psychological condition where people and oppressed people, or certainly a lot of them, will deny their oppression, especially those who are benefiting from the system.
Yeah,
and they don't see any disadvantage. But Scotland is way underdeveloped, and even the middle classes now are probably suffering and asking,
they are.
What is our optimal situation here?
Yeah.
Is it to keep on the coattails of a fallen empire, power a bankrupt London, or go ourselves? And as I say, our leakage of wealth from this country is enormous, and now we've got renewables which could be generating 100 billion a year soon. And that is worth more than the oil was.
I know.
So we're sitting there just getting fleeced, and all our properties are just getting sold up to anybody around the world. And any private equity group in the world can own any of our infrastructure and our utilities. So we are completely enslaved to global markets, if you like, and having no control over our economy, our population, our future, our infrastructure. Yeah, and that's the key thing: no control over our future. And matters of war and peace. There's Ireland, since independence, managed to avoid 80 military conflicts Britain's dragged Scotland into.
I know.
And what benefit have we had from that? Absolutely zero. None of these conflicts were, well, apart from one maybe, were absolutely essential. So most of them were decolonisation conflicts.
Well,
Scotland was dragged in to fight England's battles.
Well, here's the thing, Alf. Are we at the point where we're no longer 90-minute nationalists? We're much, much more than that. We're much more educated since 2014. We're looking at things. Social media has been a curse and a help as well.
Yeah. I think that's been a massive difference, is the social media in relation to what I liken it to is the anti-colonial literature that has to come out to let people understand their position, their condition, and the media, the websites, the radio, everything that has been pro-independence has been a new aspect to that, because the mainstream media is completely imperial, completely unionist. Completely colonial. Because you have to remember that in a colonial society, all the institutions are colonial in nature and ideology and in their values. So everything from monuments to museums, to schools to universities are colonial, the justice system as well. So the whole thing is geared towards maintaining the status quo, which is a colonial situation. So it's very difficult to get against that. But the literature that's coming out, the articles, even my book on Doon Hodden and some other papers that I've written and others have written, and Gareth Grousepeter as well has been very to the fore, and some others, Barhead Boy, Yours for Scotland, Wings as well, and Peter Bell too. And Peter Bell was very interesting as well, because as someone who didn't believe that we were colonised, he wrote a very interesting paper about what he called the New Thinking.
Aye. I know.
And he was very, very much an SNP guy and going with the flow and letting them get on with it. But like many of us in the SNP some years ago, but a lot of it, people now question that and question their strategy, or they don't have a strategy.
Well, Alf,
and they don't really understand what independence means, which the postcolonial theory tells you, and the UN tell you, it's decolonisation.
Yes, that's right.
Decolonisation.
That's right.
And there's no other outcome it has,
No.
It's a decolonisation, and if you're going for independence decolonisation, it means you've been colonised.
Well, I tell you what, we must be on the right track if Peter Bell can be convinced of its merits.
Well, that's right. I mean, his paper also borrowed on the great work of Salvo and Sarah Salyers about unearthing the reality about the claim of right, and the reality of that as a condition of the treaty, and the treaty as being just another manket, corrupt, worthless treaty handed to a bunch of nations. So we talk about the Treaty of Union and Scotland being a partner and all this, but pretty much every colonised people were handed a worthless, corrupt treaty.
I know. Well, where are we now then? Because you've been voted on by 94%, I think it was. People wanted you onto the Liberation. Is it Liberation.Scot committee?
Well, yeah, it's the Liberation Scotland, I think. I'm not sure of maybe the full thing, but it's certainly to do with liberation. I think that the reality there is, as Salvo and others have found over the years, the recent years, is that the political route has kind of failed.
Yes.
Political route to independence. The political route does fail, especially when you have a compromised national party that becomes part of the racket. And that's what's happened. And they take the people up a blind alley and just delay independence. And that's what causes potential problems. But that's what they've done. It leaves it to the people, the ordinary folk, to get together and see if they can manage to liberate. There are ways to do it through mechanisms that some people regard as difficult, like the UN and so on. But the UN is there, the self-determination law is there, the international law on self-determination.
Can I ask, Alf, why do you think it's difficult going to the United Nations?
Well, the problem that we've had is that the Scottish National Party has never done it.
I know.
I was arguing some years ago when they got into government, get the minister into the UN, have a permanent representation.
Aye.
As a liberation movement, as a minister of a Scottish government elected by people to have independence. And they should have been knocking on the UN door, not number 10.
Well, Joe, I've been
Mike
looking.
Russell kept on going back and forth to number 10.
I know.
Ted always tail between his legs.
And well, the thing is, they were trying to exhaust every option and show the people that we couldn't do it. But what was the end game for all that? I have no idea. But I tell you what,
they ended up just taking you down to Section 30, and that in postcolonial theory, that is what's called the legal tendency. So the dominant National Party becomes what's called the legal tendency.
Yes.
They just operate within the legal confines of power, rather than looking to international law, which is the correct way to go, and also to look at. We have to remember Scotland has its own legal system, which is unlike many colonies.
I know.
We have it's our own legal system. What are the justiciary doing for Scottish sovereignty? Because they are part of Scottish sovereignty, and they are one of the legacies of Scottish sovereignty. Without Scottish sovereignty, they wouldn't exist.
Exactly.
So they have to be questioned as well about what are the violations to the treaty, what are the violations to Scottish sovereignty and the Scottish Constitution, because there is a Scottish Constitution.
I know.
It goes back to the claim of right and a lot before that as well. So and the Scottish courts will have in the past quoted a lot of this. So it's not nonsense. It's part of our reality. It's part of our history, and of course that's the other aspect in colonialism. People's history is wiped out.
Yeah.
It's rewritten for them.
Well, I mentioned that earlier with the Covenant of 1949. Hardly anyone knows that, and I was.
This is it. Our history is rewritten for us by you know who, and a colony is no longer really a part of history.
No, worse than that, Alf. Ali Heather was visiting a church, an old castle, and it was on the edge of the beach, and it was going to be in 10 years' time. It won't be there because of coastal erosion, etc. But he said something that got me on my heels. He says, we used to have 3,000 castles. Now we have half that. And we used to have a castle in Glasgow. Did you know that, Alf? There used to be a castle there. But during the John McLean era, it was dismantled and Rotten Row was built right on top of it. So our history is not just being airbrushed, it's been destroyed.
Yeah, no, I used to have an office in a castle. It was Merchiston Castle at Napier.
Aye.
And that was where Napier's logs were invented. Algorithms. So, Scotland has a lot of heritage that we don't... well, of course, the heritage that we have is controlled by people with the values of the imperial power, the colonizer.
Yes, exactly.
So our cultural heritage it takes on the values of, the Britishness, as it were. And most of the people running that take on these values as well. That's why we end up with statues like the Sutherland statue that shouldn't necessarily be there, or should have something else there. Rather than Duke of Sutherland sitting on that hill above Golspie, or even so many other monuments like the Duke of Wellington in Glasgow, or even Dundas and St Andrews Square in Edinburgh. These are colonial monuments that celebrate the greatness of the colonial power. My wife's done a few papers on this as well from her archaeological perspective too. We're not taught our history about that, but we have a colonial legacy all around us. The street names, the statues, everything. Ireland had to deal with that. Other colonies had to deal with that, and Scotland will have to deal with it if it becomes independent. Well,
in Uddingston, just down the road from me, there's a North Britain Street. Can you beat that for colonial?
Exactly. I mean, at every town in Scotland, practically, there's a Victoria this or an Albert that.
Well, the other thing that really baffles me, Alf, is we've got places like Coat Bridge, right? You take two words and you put them together almost, and you've got a place name. But actually, if you go back in history, the coat of arms was on the bridge, and it's got a Gaelic name that means a lot more than this two words, coat and bridge. And then we've got Motherwell, and nobody knows why it's called Motherwell, because of water. And other places around Scotland, we've been anglicised to such an extent we don't even know our place names.
I did a bit of study of the Picts as well, and it's amazing how important the Picts were, but we never get any. We never get any of that.
No.
We never get much about the merger or the alliance between the Picts and the Gaels to create the Scottish Kingdom. And what happened there, and about the Norse coming in. So there is so much about it, but Scotland's history, I think to some extent Scotland could have had even a different name eventually. And some countries after liberation do have a different name, of course.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. Maybe it's Caledonia or something. I don't know.
Yeah, well, this is what the Romans used to call us.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
Caledonists. So
Yeah.
the Caledonians, and our customary foe was the Bretoni, and Pictavia and all. Pictavia.
That's right. Aye.
Yeah,
well,
so yeah, we have a fantastic history going back to Neolithic and before, and we don't get taught it at all, or to any great extent.
But this is all adding up, Alf, to a big, huge packet, a big, huge box of arguments to take to the United Nations, isn't it? Because the United Nations is big on decolonisation. Because just to tell the listeners, Alf, just to get them a bit of background on this, when the United Nations was established back in 1945 after the war, 750 million people off their website, I'm reading here, almost a third of the world's population then lived in territories that were non-self-governing, dependent on colonial powers. It's all over the UN articles. Since then, more than 80 former colonies have gained their independence through going to the United Nations, through that medium. So now, surely, it's Scotland's turn to rock up to the United Nations and take the fight away from Westminster, where we're always going to lose, and ask Keir Starmer to appear at a United Nations meeting to argue his case that Scotland is not a colony. He would lose, wouldn't he?
Well, I would hope so. But the evidence is pretty overwhelming.
Yes.
That Scotland is not fully self-governing at all, and that its history is definitely a colonial history in most, if not all, respects. So, yeah, I think it can be a solid case can be made for that. And as you say, the UN was created largely to bring about the decolonisation and the end of the major imperial powers.
Aye.
That's what the UN was created for, largely, was to create the end of the great imperial powers that always had these incredibly massive wars and conflicts.
Aye.
Largely about grabbing other territories that they didn't necessarily have a legal right to. So, yeah, and the self-determination process, the convention is there, the convention and the granting of independence to colonized countries and territories is there. So, yeah, all that international law is well embedded now. It's it's very, very possible for Scotland or any territory that feels it's under colonial rule to bring a case, and that's what should be done. That's what should have been done by the SNP. I
know. Well, precedents have been made, have been set. So the decolonisation agenda, this is what I love, Alf. They've got an annual cycle of what happens. So in February, they have an annual session, and it selects its bureau, the chair and the rapporteur and all that kind of stuff. And then later on in March, April, they decide, I'm reading off their, they decide a venue and dates for a annual general meeting of all the guidelines for this argument. And then by May, they've got a regional seminar. And then by June, and before you know it, you're up to October and a decision is made. That is quick, isn't it?
Yeah, well, a lot depends on different things, but I'm sure that the Liberation Committee will push that door, and that's one of the objectives. It's not been pushed before for Scotland. There was a UN committee back in the 60s and 70s that actually led in turn to the creation of the Scottish Parliament. So a UN Scotland committee did actually have some positive outcomes in that sense, but as we know, the devolved Parliament is not really able to do, well, in many cases it's a colonial administration, so it's part of the colonial system.
Well,
and that's been the failure. It's become a colonial administration. If it was anything different at all, that was questionable. It's always been that, and it's always had a constrained remit with an eye always to London. For ultimate decisions, and even the manning, the man and woman power that run it is pretty much all Whitehall's finest, we might say. So So it goes back to the thing about the institutions. If you're in a colonial society, your institutions are all colonial. And that's what essentially has to change. The values, the nature of the objectives, and the allegiance, of course, of the people that run these institutions. Has to be changed, and that is a fundamental shift. So it's a big challenge to do this, but I think the UN is one of the starting points, and maybe not the only one.
Well, there's the International Court of Justice. We could go that way. The European Union, although we're not in the European Union anymore. There's other things, but getting representation at the United Nations. Scotland isn't part of it. We're part of the United Kingdom, which is part of the United Nations.
Yeah, I think that what is the case is liberation movements tend to be recognised by the UN organs and agencies.
Yes.
Where there's a liberation movement, it's not political parties.
Aye. Political
parties are probably not entertained really, but liberation movements coming from the people themselves are a different ballgame, and that is normal. That is the normal process.
Yes, and one of the processes in this decolonisation agenda, the annual cycle I was talking about, is that they hear views from the member states and the administrating powers and from individuals. That means you, Alf, you will have to get over to the United Nations in New York and plead the case for Scotland, mate.
Yeah, well, I've worked with the UN agencies before in shipping and trade terms, different agencies in Latin America and also in Asia. So I know how they work to develop trade, and these were also developed at times of decolonization, where these countries had to refocus their trade and their seaports away from the imperial powers that dominated them and extracted their wealth. So I know that Scotland faces the same situation. We have to reorientate our trade away from the mother country, as it were. One of the Unionists' big plus points they always claim is we trade with our biggest partner, England. But actually, the reality is most of our trade is taken out cheap, and what we bring in comes expensive.
Yes.
So it's actually dysfunctional for the economy, and that also affects our GDP and GDP per capita being half what it should be. So we need to globalize a little bit and get our trade oriented to get our trade shipped out to the people that want to pay the right price. And this is what former colonies first had to do. So the UN understood this. It had agencies like ECLAC and UNCTAD.
That's right.
Were created to help the newly developing countries that were decolonized to reorientate their trade away from the imperial powers and to benefit from that for their people, their whole economy, and so on. And we see hundreds of examples of that. Some great examples like Dubai and Singapore, Malta. There's so many around the world. Oman. I've been to Oman and worked there for a while, and it was quite incredible what they did in Dubai too.
Yes, indeed.
Singapore, Malaysia. There's so many examples that have done well and are still trying to do well, like India too.
Well, can I ask a question then, Alf, about difficulties going to the United Nations? I know there'll be an equal and opposite force coming against us who are going to be claiming that we're a colony. What are the big difficulties we can then see then coming from those who oppose us?
Well, the classic British position has always been that it's a kind of partnership of equals, and the treaty and everything, and that kind of argument. But I think the fundamental realities can be. Evidence can be provided about the more fundamental reality. So that case has to be made.
Yes, it does.
I don't think we can, that case has to be made. And then if it gets to the legal situation, then courts have to provide an opinion on these matters, and that will be obviously an important and if not decisive moment too. I always hoped that a Scottish court might look at also the treaty violations that Scotland has been subject to, and the violations of the Claim of Right Act and so on, because that would be informative for the Scottish people as well.
It would.
And if that treaty is violated, then it means the UK is basically a void contract, as it were. But the reality with treaties is that when they're no longer in the interests of the signatory, they should be ended.
Yes.
And this is what the Scottish parliamentarians have failed to do, and that's why the people then have to look for alternative peaceful means like liberation.
Well, in the Scottish Parliament elections in 2 years' time, what do we need to see happening then? Is politics and political parties a busted flush and we just got to ignore them?
Well, unless people can organise a reasonable solution to the democratic deficit, then it might well be a busted flush. So, yeah, I think there's certain strategies that are interesting, like Alba's proposal to use the list vote as a plebiscite on independence. And that could well provide additional evidence that the people want independence.
Evidence, that's what we
need. That evidence could then be useful in any subsequent or any court cases that might happen, or any approaches to the UN where you then have a decision on that. But the worry for me is also, or for others as well, is also the franchise that we have. And the franchise we have is, for Holyrood, is what's called a local government franchise.
Right.
It's based on residents.
Correct.
It's a pretty irregular type of franchise to use for a referendum on liberation or decolonisation. And this is the other thing, that the UN agencies, if there has to be a referendum, and bear in mind that a referendum is not an essential requirement for independence, but if there has to be a referendum of some form, then it might well be better to have the UN agencies come in and deal with that, rather than the Electoral Commission doing its thing and the other organs of the state, which, going back to the point I made, that all the institutions are colonial in nature. And that includes government, central government, devolved government, local government, agencies and other bodies involved. So it has a particular agenda, perhaps.
But when we talk about business and politics, and those are the big drivers for change in Scotland, it might be that football and culture might be the thing that really attracts the people on the ground. I'm thinking of Scotland in the Euros and that warm welcome we got from the Germans. And the Germans said to us that Scotland were the epitome of goodness and greatness that Europe should be, because over in Germany right now, Alf, there's a right-wing agenda going. In Holland, there's a right-wing zealot in power. In France, we've seen the right-wing. In Britain, we've seen it as well. So this was a cultural welcoming. And it seems to me that Scotland is cutting against all that with their fans. And I think that could put us in good stead.
Well, it does. Scots are welcomed everywhere we go, usually.
Usually.
But yeah, the other odd thing about the Euros was that Scotland was the only stateless nation in the...
I know!
Out of the 32, we were the odd one out. We weren't self-governing, but we were still there, although our imperial power would probably prefer we weren't there.
I know.
Because again, that raising of national consciousness is so important. And people, the Scots over there and the Scots here looking at this will probably still wonder, why aren't we self-government? Why aren't we governing our own affairs like everybody else that can do that? So there's no doubt that Scots can do it, but we need to think carefully. But your point about culture and the culture and the language is so important. It's critical to the whole thing.
Another thing that's really important, Alf, is when the Scots go over there en masse to Germany, they see different things. They see how their roads are better. They see how their infrastructure's all better. It's geared.
Well, I was an economic migrant in 1980. Once shipping collapsed and everything, I ended up working in building sites in Germany, in Munich actually, for several months. And so I was, and there was busloads of people from Scotland shipped all over Europe when Thatcher got in, and the economy was trashed, and public expenditure was trashed and collapsed. So Scots had to. We were the economic migrants of Europe.
Yeah.
And I spent several months in Munich, and the first thing you see is the quality of the buildings, the quality of the infrastructure, quality of the leisure facilities, the flatness of the football pitches, and I played football there as well. The local team near Rosenheim. And I was fortunate to have studied a couple of years in school to learn a bit German as well, so I was able to
brilliant.
Pick up the language really quick, because where I was in rural Germany, they didn't speak any English, so it was great.
That's a good thing.
To learn Deutsch.
Well, one of the great things about the language is they can pronounce their achs as well, and English carry. So that's we've got great cultural connections across Europe, and we shouldn't forget them. But one of the things, somebody messaged me here, Alf, he's listening to the show, he says, football's coming home. Scots invented the passing game. He's saying that we've had our history stolen from us. How can England say football's coming home when it's a Scotland passing game, you know?
Well, I mean, the Scottish football teams were established in the 1860s.
Aye.
And my own team, Hearts, was 1874. and my father used to play for Falkirk, but that's another thing.
Wow.
But football's in our blood. And
it is.
One of my first realizations of Scottish national consciousness was being at Hampden. I think in '73 was against Czechoslovakia for qualifying for the German game when Joe Jordan scored the winner. And the place had 136,000 in it, and there was sold tires. And that kind of national consciousness is very important.
Well,
in
not
developing just a people and a people's identity and who they are, because imperialism makes them something they are not.
Correct.
And it gives them another identity. And we're into all these cultural wars at the moment, but national identity is where colonialism distorts people, changes a people's identity. And that's the same. Well,
I can only say by hearsay that the anthems, the Scotland anthem was the loudest at the Euros. I remember Scotland playing England at I think it was the anniversary of Scottish football, and had to play England. And Ali McCoist was given his usual Anglo-centric view of things and upset that Scotland were booing the God Save the King anthem. Well, wait a minute, Ali, I thought that was a UK anthem or a British anthem. You know. But the other the massive thing, Alf, the massive thing about all that is that now most youngsters who've been over to Germany with their mums and dads come back and they see that Hampden is not fit for purpose. Who built that stadium when you've got stadiums over there? It's all those things that are coming together now.
Well, everything in Scotland needs looked at. You know, as you know, I work a lot in the ferry sector, and there's Norrie, over 100 electric ferries, and we don't have any.
I know.
But their electricity is a quarter of the price of ours.
Exactly.
You know, their electricity is 10 cents per kilowatt hour. Ours is 40 cents. So ours is the highest electricity in Western Europe.
Shocking.
And we've got the lowest GDP per capita in Western Europe, Northwestern Europe. So there's obviously a linkage. We've been made into a non-competitive economy. You can imagine what our industries would have been looked like with cheapest electricity in Europe. And I noticed there was some guy from the energy industry interviewed by Laura Koonsberg the other day, and he was saying Scotland could have the cheapest electricity in Europe, which we could.
I know.
We could have had that years ago.
Exactly.
But our economy has been decimated, and we've had the problem with colonialism is the colonies it's given a kind of narrow specialization in any industry.
It has.
So we had a very narrow industrial specialization in mining and steel and all that. So that was always subject to shocks.
Yes, indeed.
And then you had millions unemployed, and I suffered from that, and many millions others suffered from it and had to move abroad to work. So we see that, and nowadays our economy is very, very delicate still. And we've had no growth for decades.
I know.
We've had no growth for decades, and this is it. And you don't get growth without trade, and without trade, without ports and without modern shipping connections, you don't get trade.
That's
right. I've actually written a maritime policy with Roy Peterson in Inverness, who used to be head of transport for Highlands Enterprise and head of the council for Inverness for transport. And we wrote a maritime policy for the SNP. It was passed at the Aberdeen conference some years ago, but they never implemented it.
Wow. What a waste of time and effort. Man.
Yeah, the civil servants just said, you can't do that, Minister, you can't do this, and you can't do that. So that's the problem with Scotland. You might elect the nationalist government, but if they don't control the policy agenda, the policy implementation, then they're just going to do as their civil servants tell them. And that's what's happened in Scotland.
Well, that's right, Alf, because we've rejected that SNP in its form. We're now looking towards, other civic movements to go by, because I honestly think we're at a turning point here. With Sarah Salyers and her team and yourself, Alf, with your book, we're all...
Well, what the book tells you as well is that in colonialism, there's only two options. You either have liberation and independence, decolonization, self-recovery, or you're assimilated.
Or you're assimilated.
And ultimately, the nation perishes.
I know. But, Alf, can you leave us with some good news?
A colonized nation is in the process of perishing.
Well, Alf, can you leave us with some good news? And people will be listening to this wanting to know what the next moves are. Are we ready to go to the United Nations? Have we got a case, and are we able to then go across there and plead that we're a colony?
But I think there's a very solid legal and historical case and that can be made, and people are putting their heads together now. And this is what we've not had before. Is we've had just conflict between different peoples, but people are putting their heads together and getting the right approach. And the postcolonial theory guides us in a sense, because we know that the compromised political classes kind of fail.
Yes.
And it's then left to the people, one way or another, to provide the mechanism to liberate the people and nation. So,
I'm telling you.
I don't see any other choices at the moment.
Nope.
If anybody's got any better ideas, fire ahead.
Well, I've been waiting a lifetime, Alf, and I haven't got anything. But this one, because the United Nations is built on this.
That's what it's there for.
Aye.
Decolonise colonies.
Yeah.
And it's got the legal instrument and mechanism to do it. And that legal mechanism is self-determination, which is decolonisation. And that is what we should use.
Indeed, Alf. Listen, Alf, thank you so much for joining us on Caledon Radio. We've explored a lot of avenues. And well, maybe in 6 months after Salvo and yourself and Liberation Scotland get together, we might get another chat to see where we are. Maybe 6 months' time. It might be very interesting.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, Alf. Thank you so much.
All the best.
All the best. There's Alf. Right, we had some music bubbling about in the background.